The parents of Chicago's most feared crime boss screamed at exactly 3 a.m. every single night. Doctors called it Alzheimer's hallucinations, but when the home nurse finally tore open the antique music box on their nightstand, she found the ghost the old couple had been warning everyone about for 2 months. Frank and Maggie Ashford were in their 70s, parents of Cole Ashford, the man who ran the underground trucking empire controlling every warehouse on Chicago's South Side, the man who could silence an entire city block with a single phone call. Cole had everything: money, power, and the fear of the whole city. Yet for the past 8 weeks, that man had been completely powerless, watching his parents fall apart night after night. At 3 o'clock sharp, both of them would bolt upright, clutching their heads, crying out the same words. The ghost is humming. It's calling a name. Their screams shattered the silence of the lakeside estate. And when exhaustion finally dragged them back to sleep, the cycle would reset. 3 a.m., precise as a clock, cruel as torture. Cole spent whatever it took. A top neurologist examined them for 3 days and found nothing. A psychiatrist prescribed pills that only made things worse. Everyone had an explanation. No one had an answer. Because the truth wasn't hiding in 2 fading memories, it sat right on their nightstand, wrapped in a gentle melody, singing to them every single night. If you believe our elders deserve to be heard even when their memories fade, hit that like button and share this story. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the heart. Now, let's begin. Dr. Harold Simmons entered the mansion overlooking Lake Michigan on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by 2 young assistants and the confidence of a man with 20 years of experience in geriatric neurology. He crossed the marble foyer with the air of someone accustomed to being welcomed into elegant places, carrying a leather case filled with instruments, while speaking in professional terms that made the 2 assistants behind him nod rapidly in agreement. Cole Ashford met them at the foot of the staircase, his jaw clenched, his eyes bloodshot after yet another sleepless night. He didn't offer his hand. He merely tilted his head toward the 2nd floor and led them upstairs in silence. His parents' bedroom stood at the end of the hallway, its windows facing the lake. Frank sat on the edge of the bed in striped pajamas, the shoulders that had once terrified the entire Chicago underworld, now sagging like a coat left hanging for too many years. Maggie sat beside her husband, her hands clasped together in her lap, obedient as a schoolgirl waiting for her name to be called. Dr. Simmons gave them his professional smile, the kind of smile that worked on ordinary patients in ordinary families. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Ashford. I'm Dr. Simmons. I'm here to find out why you haven't been sleeping well. Frank looked up at him for a long moment, then turned toward Cole, his face suddenly brightening. Is that you, Tommy? He said, his voice trembling with joy. Tommy, have you come home to visit your father? The room fell silent for a beat. Tommy was Frank's younger brother, a man who had been buried for 40 years. Cole stepped closer, placed a hand on his father's shoulder, and lowered his voice. It's Cole, Dad, your son. Frank blinked and studied him as though he were an old acquaintance whose face he knew but whose place in his memory he couldn't find. Then he nodded vaguely, the nod of a man who had learned that agreeing was easier and caused less trouble. The examination lasted 40 minutes. Simmons shone a light into Maggie's eyes, making her blink again and again. He told her to raise her hand, and she raised it. He asked her to count backward from 10, and she reached 7 before drifting into some lullaby from her girlhood. She followed every instruction with perfect obedience, but her eyes were empty, like a house from which every piece of furniture had been removed. Every so often, she turned to search for Frank's hand, as though it were the only thing in the room that was still real. The 2 assistants took notes on their tablets, whispering medical words Cole didn't understand. But the way they whispered made his chest tighten again and again. At last, Simmons removed his stethoscope, stepped back, exchanged a discreet nod with the 2 assistants, and turned toward Cole with an expression carefully designed to reassure, though his voice carried the unmistakable weight of condescension. Mr. Ashford, I've examined them thoroughly. Physically, their hearts and lungs are both in reasonable condition for their age. The problem lies in the progression of the illness. They're both experiencing rapidly advancing cognitive decline, accompanied by auditory hallucinations, meaning they hear sounds that aren't there. The humming and the voices calling their names are very typical symptoms. Cole stood motionless as his hands slowly tightened into fists at his sides. Then why did they both become ill at the same time? He asked, his voice held firmly under control. The same night, at the same hour, hearing the same thing. Explain to me, doctor, what are the chances of that happening? Simmons folded his arms and tilted his head, assuming the posture of an adult, explaining something to a slow child. In medical literature, we call this a resonance syndrome among elderly married couples. When two people have lived together for 50 years, their biological rhythms, habits, and even their fears become synchronized. One person panics in the middle of the night, the other wakes and panics as well, and they continue amplifying each other until it becomes a repeating cycle. It's actually quite common. Common, Cole repeated. And something in that single word seemed to make the temperature in the room fall several degrees. Simmons didn't notice, or couldn't be bothered to notice. He opened his case, removed a prescription pad, and began to write. I'm going to increase the dosage of the antipsychotic medication and add a mild sedative to break the nighttime cycle. And, Mr. Ashford, I'm saying this in my professional capacity. He removed another sheet of paper bearing the printed heading of his clinic and signed his name at the bottom. I'll leave my recommendation in writing. Given the speed of their decline, the family should consider moving them into a specialized care facility as soon as possible. They'll have a night staff there, along with treatment protocols designed for their condition. To put it plainly, a family home, no matter how well equipped, is no longer an appropriate environment for them. The paper never had a chance to leave his hand. Cole stepped forward once, and all three people in white coats instinctively stepped back, guided by the sudden awareness that the man standing before them didn't belong to the world of oak-paneled clinics. Cole's voice was very quiet, and it was the quietness that made it terrifying. I'm paying you $15,000 for this morning. Before you, 7 specialists came into this room. They ran scans for 3 days, attached monitoring equipment all over my parents' bodies, and every one of them told me the same thing. Very typical. Quite common. Your medication leaves my father unable to lift a soup spoon during the day, yet at 3 o'clock in the morning he's still screaming until his throat is raw. And now you're standing here, signing a piece of paper that tells me to remove my parents from their own home. Simmons tried to recover some measure of authority. He cleared his throat. Mr. Ashford, I understand that you're under a great deal of stress, but my diagnosis is based on... Your diagnosis, Cole interrupted, is that you don't have an answer, but you're too arrogant to admit it. He pointed toward the door. Get out of my house. Send the bill to my accountant, and don't ever come back. The 3 white-coated figures retreated so quickly that they nearly tripped over one another at the doorway. Their footsteps echoed down the staircase, then disappeared completely beyond the gravel drive. The room sank once more into a thick and suffocating silence. At some point, Frank had lain back down. His eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling, his lips moving around a melody that made no sound. Maggie still sat in exactly the same position, and her searching hand found the old music box on the bedside table. She pulled it a little closer, like a child holding the only thing that made her feel safe, or perhaps the only thing she had been told she must protect. Cole stood in the center of the room, watching the 2 people who had given him life dissolve a little more each night, like sand slipping through his fingers. Outside that room, all he had to do was pick up a telephone, and an entire neighborhood would fall silent. Shipping containers would change direction. Names would disappear from the books. People whispered that there was nothing in the city Cole Ashford couldn't buy. But that morning, standing in the sunlit bedroom overlooking the lake, he understood a bitter truth. For the first time in his life, the thing he needed most was the one thing no one could sell him: an answer. Tessa Ward appeared in the doorway, carrying a neatly folded stack of clean bedsheets in her arms. She had been waiting in the hallway the entire time the doctors were inside, standing out of sight behind the door, in exactly the way servants in houses like this were taught to stand, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, existing nowhere. She lowered her head as she entered, placed the sheets on top of the wardrobe, and spoke softly. I'll change the sheets for them, Mr. Ashford. Cole didn't answer. He remained there a little longer, looking at his parents, then went downstairs, his footsteps growing heavier before disappearing beyond the curve of the staircase. Tessa began her work. She gently helped Frank sit up as though she were lifting a piece of porcelain, arranged pillows behind his back, then stripped the old sweat-dampened sheet from the mattress with movements that were neat and quiet, without a single unnecessary rustle. Years of working in this house had taught her its rhythm. When the old couple was most lucid, when confusion rolled in like the tide, and when one sharp noise was enough to leave Maggie frightened for the rest of the afternoon. Before this, Tessa had worked at a memory care center, where she had learned to read people with Alzheimer's the way one might read words slowly fading from a page. She had left that place in a way she hadn't chosen, but she told no one in this house about it. They had hired a pair of hands, not a life story. After changing the sheets, she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Frank's thin arm, inflated it, recorded the number in the small notebook she always carried in her apron pocket, then moved to Maggie's side. It was time for her medication, but the old woman pressed her lips tightly together and turned her face away as she always did. And as always, Tessa didn't force her. She simply sat on the edge of the bed, took the wrinkled hand in hers, and softly sang an old nursery rhyme about a paper boat drifting down a river, a tune Maggie had once murmured to herself. By the third line, Maggie's lips began to move along with the song. A tiny spark appeared in her empty eyes, like a light suddenly glowing in the window of an abandoned house, and in that brief moment, she obediently opened her mouth and swallowed the pill with the sip of water Tessa offered her. But as she watched Maggie swallow, something unsettled began to stir inside her. She had seen this kind of stupor before. During the day, the old couple moved like shadows, their eyes glazed, their responses slow, half the soup spilling from the spoon before it reached their mouths, both of them drifting in and out of sleep throughout the afternoon. Yet at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, they still bolted upright and screamed until they were exhausted. The sedative dosage had been increased again and again, and it was pressing these two people into the ground without touching whatever was tormenting them. At her former job, Tessa had seen patients subdued in the same way, and she knew all too well what it felt like to stand there watching with nothing in her hands but a notebook filled with observations. She was folding the old sheet when she noticed it, the detail she would later remember as the moment everything began. Maggie reached toward the antique music box on the bedside table, a polished walnut piece with 2 birds carved into the lid, and the instant her fingertips touched the wood, her hand jerked back as though she had touched a hot stove. Tessa stood still, the sheet half folded in her hands. Then she saw Maggie stare at the music box for a long time, with the wary expression of someone watching a sleeping animal. Slowly, the same hand that had recoiled reached out again, pulled the box closer to her pillow, and wound the key one turn after another with a mechanical obedience so unnerving it chilled the air. "Why do you wind it, Mrs. Ashford?" Tessa asked, making her voice sound as ordinary as possible. Maggie looked up and answered in the dutiful voice of a child reciting a lesson she had memorized. "Denise told me to. It has to sing every night. The music will keep the ghosts away." Denise was Frank's younger sister, the elegant woman who visited every week carrying a pot of soup and offering embraces scented with perfume. Tessa looked at the music box, then at the 2 birds carved into the wooden lid, and an unnamed feeling crawled along her spine, the instinct that years of caring for people had sharpened in her, telling her that something in this room was lying. Before she could think any further, a dry, bony hand closed around her wrist. Frank had sat up without her noticing, and he was looking directly at her, not with the distant gaze that had passed through everything lately, but with a focused, desperate stare, like a man trying to speak through a wall of glass. "Denny broke my wooden horse," he whispered, his voice rough and strained. "Then she cried first so Mother would punish me. June 19th. His grip tightened. She always cried first. Remember that. She always cried first." Then, as suddenly as he had seized her, his hand loosened, his eyes clouded, the focus dissolved, and he lay back down again, his lips moving around the same silent melody, leaving Tessa standing there with the warm imprint of his fingers still pressed into her wrist. People would have called it the rambling of a failing mind, a broken fragment of memory about a toy shattered 70 years ago, rising briefly before sinking away again without beginning or end. But Tessa had spent enough time beside people like Frank to understand something medical books rarely explained. When memory was nearly gone, what remained was often what had been carved the deepest, and the sick weren't babbling meaningless things. They were speaking about what mattered most, at a time when no one wanted to listen anymore. That night, after turning off the hallway lights and hearing the music box being wound steadily behind the old couple's bedroom door, Tessa didn't go to bed. She sat in the small staff room with the door left open, a narrow crack, the lights off, a cup of tea slowly cooling on the table, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the hallway. The clock hands crept past 12 o'clock, then 1 o'clock, then 2 o'clock. She remained perfectly still, like a trap already set, and waited. 3 nights passed in exactly the same way, with Tessa sitting behind the narrow opening of her door beside a cup of cold tea, listening as the screaming erupted at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, then hearing Cole's footsteps pound along the hallway. On all 3 nights, she stood silently at the bedroom threshold and watched, remembering, comparing, waiting for one final piece that even she couldn't yet name. On the 4th night, she didn't wait inside her room. She carried a small chair into the hallway and sat only a few steps from the old couple's door, a thin blanket spread across her lap, her eyes open in the darkness. The glowing hands of her wristwatch moved forward little by little. 2:50, 2:55, 2:59. She held her breath and counted each second, and at the exact moment, the minute hand touched 12, as though someone somewhere had flipped a switch. The first scream tore through the night. It wasn't the scream of a nightmare. Tessa had heard enough screams in her years of caregiving to know the difference. This was the scream of a body being attacked by something, and immediately afterward, no more than a breath later, the second scream joined it. 2 aged voices twisting together into a chain of sound that made her scalp go numb. She sprang to her feet, the blanket falling to the floor, and shoved the door open as she rushed inside. The room was flooded with the pale blue light of the night lamp, and the sight before her looked like a painting someone had twisted out of shape. Frank was folded forward on his knees in the bed, both fists pressed hard against his temples, as though he were trying to keep his skull from splitting apart. His entire body rocked to a rhythm that wasn't there, and he cried out again and again, "It's humming. It's humming inside my head. Make it stop." Beside him, Maggie sat curled tightly against the headboard, her shoulders jerking with every sob, and she was calling a name. "Helen! Helen! Where are you? It's calling me, Helen." Tessa froze for half a second. Helen, Maggie's older sister, dead for 60 years. A name that existed now only beneath a black and white photograph in the sitting room. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway, and then Cole burst through the doorway, his shirt only partly buttoned, his eyes burning with a terror that no one in the city would have believed could ever appear on that face in daylight. He threw himself toward the bed and wrapped his arms around his mother. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here. No one is calling you. There's nothing here." But Maggie remained rigid in her son's arms, her gaze passing through him as though through a sheet of glass, still calling the name of her dead sister. And Tessa saw something perhaps no one else in Chicago had ever seen. Cole Ashford's hands, the same hands that had signed orders capable of making people vanish from the city without a trace, were trembling violently on his mother's thin shoulders. "Dad, look at me," he said, turning toward his father while still holding his mother with one arm, his voice breaking. "Dad, there's nothing humming. Please." But Frank couldn't hear his son. Neither of them could hear anything except whatever was tormenting them. And in that moment of absolute chaos, Tessa realized she was no longer looking at the 2 patients. She was looking at the music box. It sat on the bedside table between the 2 suffering bodies, silent and polished beneath the night lamp, the carved birds on its wooden lid seeming to stare back at her. For 3 days, the same question had gnawed at her without rest. Why had Maggie's hand jerked away as though she had touched a burning stove? Why would a treasured gift make someone shrink away in fear, yet still hold it close as though obeying an order? Tessa's feet moved before her mind had time to decide. She reached out and placed her hand on the wooden lid. Her entire body went rigid. The box was hot. It wasn't the gentle warmth of an object someone had been holding close, but heat rising from inside, the heat of a machine still running. Beneath her palm, through the walnut wood, she felt a faint vibration pulsing in a steady rhythm, so subtle that she nearly missed it, like a telephone ringing while set to silent. Tessa's breath caught. She pulled her hand away, her heart pounding high in her throat, her eyes sweeping quickly across the room before stopping at the medicine table against the wall, where a small letter opener lay beside her notebook. She snatched it up, turned back toward the bed, and had barely touched the music box when Cole's voice cracked across the room like a whip. "What are you doing? Are you out of your mind?" He had turned toward her, one arm still wrapped around his mother, his eyes fixed on Tessa with the cold suspicion of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by conspiracies. Tessa didn't step back. She looked directly into his eyes, and between the screams, she spoke each word distinctly. "Touch it. The box is hot." Cole stared at her as though she had lost her mind, but something in her face, the unmistakable certainty of someone who knew exactly what she had just felt, made him slowly extend his free hand and press it against the wooden lid. His expression changed in an instant. Tessa didn't wait any longer. She turned the box upside down, slid the point of the letter opener into the narrow gap between the wooden base and the sides, and pried hard. The old glue cracked apart. The bottom panel came loose, and she tore through the dark red velvet lining beneath it with 2 fingers. Then the entire room seemed to tilt. Resting neatly inside a hollow carved into the wood was a small black device, no larger than a matchbox, a circuit board crowded with tiny components, a miniature speaker as round as a coin, a tiny black glass lens shining like the eye of an insect, and a red light blinking once, then again, steadily and patiently, like a beating heart. Tessa hadn't even drawn another breath when it happened. The screaming stopped. Both voices fell silent at the same instant, like 2 strings of an instrument suddenly muted by an invisible hand. Silence descended upon the room so abruptly and completely that it seemed to have weight, pressing against their eardrums like the pressure inside an airplane cabin. And within that silence, the only sound left was the ragged breathing of 4 people. Maggie slowly lowered her shoulders. Her eyes were still filled with tears, but the trembling had gone. Frank gradually lowered both fists from his temples, raised his sweat-soaked face, and looked at the small black object in Tessa's hand. Then, in a voice rough but clear, every word more distinct than anything he had spoken in months, he whispered, "It's quiet now." At 4:30 in the morning, the old couple's bedroom looked more like a crime scene than a room for the sick. They had been moved to Cole's bedroom at the far end of the hallway, the door locked, a bodyguard stationed outside, and both of them had fallen into an exhausted sleep almost the moment their heads touched the pillows. Back here, beneath lights turned up to their brightest setting, a man with salt and pepper hair sat hunched over the medicine table, a jeweler's magnifying lens fixed over one eye, while a pair of fine tweezers rotated the small black device beneath the beam of a desk lamp. Ray Kowalski had once been an electronics technician in the military. Now he worked as a security consultant for clients who paid extremely well and expected him to ask absolutely no questions, and when his telephone rang shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning with Cole Ashford's name on the screen, he asked only one thing: the address. Tessa stood in the corner of the room, still holding the gutted music box in her hands. No one had told her to stay, but no one had told her to leave either, so she remained there, silently watching everything. Cole stood beside the window with his arms crossed, as still as a statue, except for the occasional tightening of his jaw. Kowalski set down the tweezers, leaned back, and gave a low whistle through his teeth. "This was custom-made," he said. "Military-grade components, every piece manufactured to order. It isn't the kind of thing you can buy on an ordinary black market." He turned the tweezers around and pointed toward the tiny round speaker, no larger than a coin. "This is an infrasound emitter. It produces sound waves at frequencies between 17 and 19 hertz, below the threshold of human hearing." "Explain it so I can understand," Cole interrupted, his voice dry and hard. Kowalski removed the magnifying lens from his eye. "It means the device emits a sound you can't hear, but your body can feel," he said. "Infrasound at this frequency affects the inner ear and the vestibular system directly. It can cause nausea, dizziness, pressure in the chest, and above all, a sense of terror with no apparent cause. A primitive fear without shape or form. People call it the ghost frequency because researchers discovered that houses rumored to be haunted often contained some natural source of infrasound, a damaged fan, a vibrating pipe." He turned the black device over and pointed toward a small chip. But whoever made this didn't stop there. Alongside the infrasound range, there's also a recorded audio track playing right at the edge of human hearing, so faintly that a lucid person would think they had imagined it. He connected the device to a small analyzer he had brought with him, put on a pair of headphones, adjusted a dial, and for a moment the weathered face of the former soldier lost its color. He removed the headphones and handed them to Cole. Cole pressed them to his ears, and Tessa watched his knuckles slowly turn white around the body of the machine. Beneath the crackle of static was a woman's voice, drawn out and humming like a lullaby, calling the same name again and again. "Maggie. Maggie." Cole lowered the headphones very slowly, as though he were afraid of breaking something, or perhaps afraid of himself. "Now imagine this," Kowalski said, his voice dropping lower. "You're a brain suffering from Alzheimer's disease. In the middle of the night, your body is suddenly overwhelmed by fear and nausea for no reason you can understand. Your heart begins racing, your chest feels crushed beneath a weight, and in the middle of that terror, a woman's voice whispers your name from somewhere you can't locate in the darkness. A healthy person could collapse under that. Imagine what it does to two minds that can no longer tell reality from memory. For those two people, it was hell in the most literal sense. But on a medical chart, it became 4 simple words. Typical auditory hallucinations. The room fell silent. Tessa heard herself swallow. Kowalski tapped the timer with the tweezers. It was programmed to activate at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, run for 20 minutes, then shut itself off. Long enough to cause damage, short enough for the physical evidence to fade by morning, leaving behind nothing but 2 exhausted old people talking about ghosts. And each time they spoke, another page was added to their medical records. Then he pointed toward the tiny glass eye. And this is a camera. Wide angle, night recording, wireless transmission within a range of roughly 60 meters. That means everything that happened inside this room over the past 2 months was recorded and transmitted to a receiver somewhere inside the house or very close to it. Whoever was behind this wasn't merely tormenting them. That person was sitting somewhere and watching. Does the house have a security camera system? Let me compare the footage and see who entered this room. No, Cole said. There are no cameras in the residential wing. I don't allow anything to record my family inside their own home. Kowalski nodded slowly without comment. The nod of a man who had worked long enough with clients who had their own reasons for not wanting to appear in any recording. Then let me bring in a team to sweep the entire mansion for signals, find the receiver, and determine whether there are any more devices. No, Cole repeated, more sharply this time. This stays inside the family. The fewer strangers who enter this house, the better. Finish analyzing this one. Find the source of the components, the workshop that manufactured it, anything that leaves a trace. I'll handle the rest myself. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and Dr. Simmons entered, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled shirt beneath his coat, a pillow mark pressed into one side of his face. Cole's call before dawn had made it perfectly clear that returning to the mansion wasn't an invitation. Simmons saw the music box torn open on the table, the black device beside the analyzer, and Kowalski, without waiting to be asked, summarized everything in a few concise sentences spoken in the language of a technician. Simmons grew paler with every sentence. That, he said, clearing his throat, that would explain the entire clinical picture. Infrasound at a sufficient intensity can cause panic, disruption of the vestibule. I mean the vestibular system. The symptoms they described. The humming sensation inside the head. The voices calling their names. All of it is entirely consistent with trauma caused by sound waves. Cole took one step toward him, and the doctor instinctively stepped back. Entirely consistent, Cole repeated, his voice so calm that it was terrifying. Yesterday, you stood in the middle of this room and signed a paper recommending that I send my parents away to an institution. You called it resonance syndrome in elderly married couples. You told me it was quite common. Mr. Ashford, this kind of device is extraordinarily rare. No physician could possibly have anticipated it. The condition presented exactly like degeneration. For 8 weeks, Cole said, his voice never rising even slightly. Every night at exactly 3 o'clock, this thing forced my parents' heads down into hell for 20 minutes, and people like you increased their medication until they were barely conscious because that made them easier to manage. Simmons opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was nothing he could say. Kowalski removed his glasses and placed the device inside a foam-lined metal case. Before closing the lid, he looked at the small black object one final time and spoke as though only to himself. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've seen every kind of way people hurt one another, but this belongs to another class entirely. Poison leaves evidence in the blood. This leaves nothing behind except a perfect medical record. He snapped the case shut. Whoever made this understands Alzheimer's disease better than the doctors do. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the lakeside mansion had become a fortress. 6 men stood around the oak table in Cole's study, summoned from every corner of the city by telephone calls before dawn, the kind of calls that, when they came, made men put on their coats and leave without asking why. The room was heavy with the smell of strong coffee and gun oil. Spread across the table was a map of the warehouse district on Chicago's south side, covered with blue circles marking territory controlled by the Ashford family, and red circles creeping steadily inward from the river. The Riverside gang has been making moves for the past 6 months, Cole said, tapping a cluster of red circles near the riverbank with his fingertip. 3 weeks ago, they took 2 of our shipments on Interstate 94 and left us with nothing. 2 weeks ago, they bought a customs contact who had been on this family's payroll for 10 years. They want the docks, They want the roots, and they know the fastest way to take everything is to break the man standing in their way. He paused, his jaw tightening. And for the past 2 months, their method has been working. Danny Fitzpatrick, a man with a scar splitting his left eyebrow whom the entire underworld called Fitz, Cole's right hand since before Cole had inherited the empire, leaned across the table. "Then there's nothing left to discuss," he said, his voice rough as grinding stone. "I'll gather the men today. Tonight, we hit their container yard by the river, burn everything to the ground, and send them a message they'll still tremble to remember 10 years from now." Several low growls of agreement rose around the table. "No," a voice said from the doorway. All 6 heads snapped around. Tessa stood at the threshold, carrying a tray of coffee. She had been told to bring it upstairs, and according to the rules of a house like this, she should have placed it on the small table by the wall and disappeared without making a sound. But she didn't put it down. She stood there with her back straight, looked past all 6 men until she found Cole's eyes, and continued, each word clear and deliberate. "You're about to start a war with the wrong enemy." A second of thick silence followed. Then the 2 men nearest the door reached beneath their jackets at the same time. "Who let the maid in here?" Fitz snarled. Cole raised one hand without looking at his men, and both hands stopped halfway. His eyes remained fixed on Tessa, cold as the lake in January. "You have something to say," he said quietly. "Say it quickly." Tessa placed the tray on the small table, stepped forward, and despite the 6 pairs of eyes measuring her like a target, walked directly to the edge of the oak table and looked down at the map with its red circles. "The gang steals your shipments on the highway, buys officials, burns parking yards," she said. "That's how they operate. Fast, loud, obvious. When they strike, they want the entire city to see it. But what about the thing inside that music box? Every component was custom made, calibrated down to the exact hertz, timed to the exact minute, and it sat quietly in your parents' bedroom for 2 months without anyone knowing." She looked up. "One side is a sledgehammer, the other is a needle. You're preparing to strike back at the hammer while the needle is still buried in the flesh of your own house." The room went completely still. Several of the men glanced at one another. Tessa continued, her voice lower now, but no softer. "Whoever placed that device in the room had to know this house intimately. They had to know which bed your parents slept in, which direction the headboard faced, that there were no cameras in the residential wing, and even what their medical records contained, so they could choose a weapon whose every symptom could be blamed on old age. An outsider couldn't have done that. This didn't come from the river. It came from inside." Fitz curled his lip and prepared to say something, but Tessa delivered the final sentence, the one she knew would set the room on fire. "And that music box was a gift from Mrs. Denise." The name fell onto the table like a misfired bullet. "She brought it here 2 months ago," Tessa said. "She placed it on the bedside table herself and told them they had to let it sing every night and think back. Every time she visited, what was the first thing she asked them? 'Do you still listen to my song every night?' She asked it every single time, before she even asked whether they were eating or sleeping well." Cole's face darkened like the sky before a storm. "Be quiet," he roared, and for the first time since the meeting began, his voice slipped beyond his control. "Denise is my father's own sister. She held me before I could walk. She's the only person in this family who has lived a clean and decent life. She took my parents to their appointments, found their doctors, and hired you to work here. She would never," he said. "She has no reason in this world to." The sentence broke off. Tessa watched it happen before her eyes, watched the moment a thought rose from somewhere deep inside him and pierced straight through his anger. Cole's pupils contracted. The storm on his face stopped, then drained away, leaving behind something ashen and far colder. "My parents' trust," he said very softly, almost to himself. Then he fell silent. No one in the room dared to ask. The 6 men who had walked beside him through some of the darkest nights the city had ever known stood motionless, because none of them had ever seen that expression on his face. After a long moment, Cole straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to the stillness of a frozen lake. "Fitz, cancel the river operation. No one touches Riverside until I give the order. Instead, I want everything on Denise Ashford Cray. Her telephone records, accounts, movements, lawyers, everything from the past 6 months, every last number. Do it in absolute silence. She mustn't smell even the faintest trace of smoke." Fitz looked at his boss, then at the woman in a servant's uniform standing beside the map, and slowly nodded before pulling out his telephone. The others followed him toward the door, one by one. Tessa picked up the tray of coffee, which had already gone cold, lowered her head, and withdrew last. As she passed him, Cole remained exactly where he was, watching her without saying a word, but his eyes were no longer the same eyes that had met her when she entered. They no longer held suspicion alone. There was a question turning endlessly inward upon itself, asking who this woman truly was, what she had seen inside this house that no one else had noticed, and what he couldn't begin to understand, where she had found the courage to dare. 2 days later, Fitz returned to the study carrying a thick file and wearing the expression of a man who had just looked into a well far deeper than he had ever imagined. Dusk had already settled outside. Cole sat behind his desk with an untouched glass of whiskey before him. Fitz placed the file on the desk and remained standing. "Do you want it piece by piece, or all at once?" he asked. "All at once," Cole said. Fitz opened the first page. Part 1. The Chain of Doctors. I traced the entire 8 weeks, from the first neurologist to Simmons. 7 names, 7 different clinics, and at first glance, none of them appeared connected. But when I worked backward and examined who had referred whom, all 7 came through the same funnel. He pulled out a sheet of paper covered with a diagram drawn in ballpoint pen, a web of arrows all converging on one name circled in the center. Your aunt. The first doctor was an old college friend of hers. The second was referred by the first after she suggested him in an email. I have a copy. The third, fourth, and fifth all belong to the medical advisory network for the chain of nursing homes she owns, and she pays each of them consulting fees as regularly as a monthly salary. As for Simmons, Fitz tapped the final name with one finger. He was chosen more carefully than any of the others. I spoke to 3 sources in the industry, and all 3 told me exactly the same thing. Simmons is known for 2 things: reaching conclusions quickly and being addicted to recommending that patients be placed in care facilities. In the private nursing home business, he's a rubber stamp. Whatever signature someone needs, he provides it. And Denise's facilities have been sending patients back and forth with his clinic for years. Cole remained motionless. So for 8 weeks, he said slowly, every doctor who walked through the doors of this house was chosen by her. Every diagnosis, every prescription, every written recommendation. I thought I was taking my parents for treatment. In reality, I was building her case for her, 1 page every week. Fitz didn't answer. He simply turned to the second section of the file. This is the part that made me check everything 3 times, he said. 3 weeks ago, a downtown law firm specializing in guardianship and elderly estates filed a petition with Family Court, expressing concern on behalf of an anonymous family member. The petition states that Frank and Maggie Ashford are suffering severe cognitive decline, and that their current care environment shows signs of being inadequate. Attached to it are copies of opinions from several medical specialists. The court accepted the petition and scheduled an independent capacity evaluation. Fitz looked up. 3 weeks from today, 2 court-appointed evaluators will come to the house, assess both of them, examine their living conditions, and evaluate their caregiver. Cole rose from his chair and walked toward the window. The lake beyond it had already merged with the darkness, leaving only the glow of the city lights staining the sky a faint red. "Finish it," he said without turning around. Fitz released a slow breath. Part 3. I put the 3 pieces together. Your parents' trust contains $20 million in assets still held in their names. Assets your father has never transferred to anyone, sitting untouched in banks and real estate. According to the will and family documents confirmed by our own attorney, if the court declares them legally incapacitated, guardianship goes first to their biological son. But you know how thick your file is in the databases of this city's police department. You've never been brought to trial, but the name Cole Ashford appears on the watch lists of at least 3 different units. All the other side has to do is place a summary in front of the judge, and no judge in this county will risk assigning 2 vulnerable elderly people to a man like you. And once the first prospective guardian is disqualified, the documents name the successor. Fitz placed the final sheet on the desk. The old man's younger sister, Denise Ashford Cray, a model citizen with an unblemished record, owner of 3 fully licensed luxury nursing homes, the kind of person any judge would look at and consider the perfect choice. The room became so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. "Then what will she do?" Cole asked, though his voice made it clear that he already knew the answer. "She won't need to do anything illegal," Fitz said, "and that's what makes it so frightening. She'll move them into the finest facility she owns, Lakeview, right on the shore. A private suite, $30,000 a month. Exclusive memory therapy, billed separately. Around-the-clock medical staff, billed separately. Specialized equipment, billed separately. A guardian has full legal authority to pay the cost of care from the assets of the people under guardianship. That's the law, and the court will praise her for being devoted. The $20 million won't be stolen. It will be paid out, one invoice at a time, slowly, cleanly, with every receipt accounted for, and no one in the world will be able to challenge it. Cole remained with his back turned, both hands braced against the windowsill, and Fitz watched his shoulders remain perfectly still for a long time. When Cole finally turned around, the look on his face made even Fitz, who had followed him for 15 years, hold his breath. It wasn't anger. Fitz had seen anger many times. This was what lay beneath anger, still and dark as the bottom of the lake. For 8 weeks, she tortured my parents to build a medical file, Cole said quietly. 7 doctors to stamp it. 1 law firm to file the petition. 1 evaluation to close the case. And a chain of nursing homes to drain every last dollar legally. He picked up the file and turned through the pages as though peeling back the layers of some unfamiliar animal. The plan didn't have a single weakness, except for one thing she couldn't have anticipated. Fitz raised his scarred eyebrow. What was that? A nurse who dared to tear apart her employer's toy, Cole said, and for a fraction of a second, something difficult to name passed through his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by the coldness Fitz knew so well. Cole looked at the desk calendar, where Sunday had been circled the week before with a small note beside it. Denise, dinner. 3 weeks is her deadline, he said. We won't need 3 weeks. She's coming for Sunday dinner as she always does. He set the file down and smoothed the cover with an almost gentle motion. Good. We'll make sure she receives a proper welcome. Since you've followed the story this far, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to support the stories still to come, because this Sunday dinner will be one the Ashford family will never forget. Denise Ashford Cray arrived at precisely noon on Sunday, carrying a pot of stewed chicken soup she called her mother's recipe, and a cloud of expensive perfume that swept into the foyer before her greeting did. She wore a cream-colored overcoat, her hair arranged in a neat, low bun, diamond earrings catching the light with every step, and she crossed the marble foyer with the ease of someone who considered the house her own, blowing a kiss toward Cole as he waited at the foot of the staircase. Where are Frank and Maggie? I've been simmering this soup since early morning. It tastes exactly the way Mother used to make it. Cole took her coat, his expression impossible to read. They're resting upstairs. Go and say hello first. Dinner will be served at 6 o'clock. Denise nodded brightly, picked up her bag, and climbed the familiar staircase. As always, the first place she turned was the old couple's bedroom. Then she stopped dead in the doorway. The room had been cleared and cleaned, the bed covered with fresh sheets, the curtains drawn wide to welcome the afternoon sunlight. But on top of the wooden cabinet beside the window, carefully displayed beneath the light like evidence in a courtroom, lay the remains of the music box, its wooden base pried loose, its red velvet lining torn open, and the empty hollow carved into the center of the wood exposed for all to see. 2 seconds. Standing at the far end of the hallway with a stack of towels in her arms, Tessa counted exactly 2 seconds in which Denise didn't move. 2 seconds when even her breathing seemed to stop. Before the machinery inside, the woman started again and began operating with flawless precision. Dear God, Denise cried, turning sharply and pressing one hand to her chest. What happened to my music box? Cole had reached the top of the staircase without anyone noticing. It was opened, he said. Denise rushed several steps toward the cabinet, then stopped as though she were afraid to touch it. Who did this? Why would anyone destroy it? I had this box specially made by a workshop in Vienna. It's carved from a single piece of walnut. I selected every note in the melody myself. It was the waltz Frank and Maggie danced to at their wedding. There was a device inside it, Cole said, still speaking in that same, even voice. A sound wave transmitter with a camera, programmed to activate at 3 o'clock every morning. That was what had been tormenting my parents for the past 2 months. From the far end of the hallway, Tessa witnessed a performance she knew she would never forget. Denise's face passed through every required emotion in perfect order and perfect rhythm. Not a second too early, and not a second too late. First came bewilderment, as though she couldn't understand the words being spoken. Then her eyes gradually widened as their meaning sank in. Her trembling hand rose to cover her mouth, followed by a strangled gasp. A device inside my music box? Finally, outrage surged at exactly the proper moment. What kind of monster would dare do such a thing? You must give me the name of that workshop. I'll telephone Vienna myself tonight. I'll hire attorneys and sue them for every last cent. They must pay for turning my gift into... Her voice broke at precisely the point where it needed to break, and one tear, a single perfectly shaped and perfectly timed tear, rolled down her carefully made-up cheek. Who found it? She asked, her voice still trembling. The nurse, Cole replied. Something flashed through Denise's eyes, so quickly that Tessa would have missed it had she not been standing at an angle at the far end of the hallway. It was the look of a predator noticing an unexpected movement in the brush. Then it vanished behind the tears. Where is the device now? I want to see it, Denise said. It's in the analysis room, Cole answered, then released his next sentence as casually as though he were mentioning an unimportant detail. My people are tracing the source of the components. Custom work like this always carries the signature of the workshop that made it. We'll have an answer in a few days. Then we'll know where it came from and every hand it passed through. Denise's shoulders stiffened for half a breath. Then she nodded rapidly. Good. Very good. You must find out. Then she turned smoothly in another direction. But Cole, let me ask you something honestly, she said, lowering her voice into the concerned tone of a loving relative. Who is this nurse? Have you examined her background carefully? Why would an ordinary servant become suspicious of a decorative box? How did she know exactly where to pry it open? Dozens of doctors came in and out of this room for 2 months, and none of them noticed anything. Yet she found it immediately. Don't you think that's far too convenient? Cole remained silent, and his silence encouraged Denise to press harder, playing the card she had kept hidden in her sleeve from the beginning. But never mind. You don't need to investigate her. I know her better than anyone, because I'm the one who found her for you. The sentence seemed to pull all the air from the hallway. Tessa felt the stack of towels grow unbearably heavy in her arms. I placed the advertisement through the employment agency, Denise continued, her voice sweet as honey, though every word was aimed directly toward the far end of the hallway where Tessa stood, and out of the entire stack of applications, I chose the worst one. A young woman who had been dismissed from a memory care center, who nearly lost her professional license, and who had been rejected by every respectable facility in the state. I felt sorry for her, Cole. I believed everyone deserved a second chance. She turned fully and looked directly at Tessa, her eyes shining with the wounded pain of someone betrayed. Now I regret it so deeply that I can't sleep. Cole turned his head in the direction of his aunt's gaze, and for the first time since that morning in the study, the look he placed upon Tessa was no longer a question. It was a scale swaying from side to side. Is that true? He asked. Were you dismissed? The hallway became utterly silent. Tessa placed the towels on the small table beside the wall because she knew that if she held them for 1 second longer, everyone would see her hands trembling. She raised her head, looked through Denise as though the woman were transparent, met Cole's eyes directly, and spoke in the calmest voice she could gather. Yes, I was dismissed from my former facility because I reported a doctor who routinely increased sedative dosages for memory patients until they were barely conscious and easier to manage. I filed a formal complaint. I gave testimony, and I was the one who was crushed, not him. She drew a breath. So more than anyone else in this house, I know exactly what this looks like, Mr. Ashford. A powerless person dares to point a finger at someone with influence, and every pair of eyes immediately turns toward the person doing the pointing. No one spoke for a long time. Denise was the one who broke the silence with a gentle sigh. Come now. There's no need to rush to judgment, she said, stepping closer and lightly patting Cole's arm. You're exhausted. Let me stay here tonight and watch Frank and Maggie. You should get 1 proper night of sleep. We'll get through this together, as a family. Tessa stood there and watched the most powerful man in Chicago give a slight nod. She watched Denise smile, pick up the overnight bag she had apparently brought with her all along, and walk toward the guest wing. A chill ran slowly down Tessa's spine because she suddenly understood that this game had been arranged long before she ever stepped inside this house, and the first piece placed upon the board had been her. On the first night after the music box had been torn open and gutted, the mansion overlooking Lake Michigan tasted something it had forgotten entirely over the past 2 months. 1 whole and unbroken night. The old couple had been returned to their bedroom after Tessa personally searched every corner of it, and Cole sat in a chair placed between the two beds from midnight onward, not watching his parents, but watching the clock. 3 o'clock in the morning arrived. 3 o'clock passed. Frank turned over once, pulled the blanket up around his shoulders, then settled back into steady breathing. Maggie slept on her side, one hand still reaching across the space between the two pillows to find her husband's hand. And for the first time in 8 weeks, her face softened into the expression people could still see in old photographs. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Cole remained in the chair, listening to the two frail rhythms of breathing weave together in the darkness. And that man, who was accustomed to giving orders to an entire city, sat as still as stone, because he feared even the smallest creak of the chair might shatter this fragile miracle. The nights that followed were the same. Quiet, complete, untouched. Color returned visibly to the old couple's faces with each passing day. Frank finished his entire bowl of soup at noon. Maggie sat beside the window watching the lake and humming the nursery rhyme about the paper boat. The whole house released a long breath, and perhaps that was precisely why no one was prepared for Sunday night. That evening, after dinner with the chicken soup and the childhood stories Denise told so gracefully that everyone at the table laughed, after she kissed her brother and sister-in-law on their foreheads and carried her bag toward the guest wing, the house turned out its lights beneath a feeling that almost resembled peace. Cole returned to his study, intending to close his eyes on the sofa for only an hour. 40 hours without sleep had burned deep hollows beneath his eyes like 2 bullet wounds. He had barely drifted off when it happened. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, a scream tore the house apart. Cole sprang up before his body had fully awakened and raced up the stairs with the reflex that 2 months had carved into his bones. In the instant he kicked open his parents' bedroom door, some part of him was still praying that he was dreaming, but he wasn't. Frank knelt, folded forward on the bed, both fists pressed against his temples, crying out that it was humming again, that it had come back, while Maggie cowered against the headboard calling the name of her dead sister, exactly the same, identical in every detail, as though the 8 peaceful nights had been nothing but a cruel joke designed to make this blow strike twice as hard. And this was what made tonight different from every other night. What broke inside that room wasn't an eardrum, but something inside Cole Ashford's chest. He stood rooted in the middle of the room. He didn't rush forward to hold his mother as he always had. He simply stood there, and Tessa, who had just reached the doorway, saw something more frightening than any scream. She saw a man breaking. The box was destroyed, he said to no one, his voice lost and unsteady. I searched this room with my own hands. That device has been locked inside a metal case in an analysis room 30 kilometers away. Then what is it? What is calling them? For 1 second, only 1 second, Tessa saw in the eyes of the most powerful man in Chicago a thought he would never admit aloud. What if the doctors had been right? What if there was no enemy at all? What if this was only the disease? And all this time he had been fighting a ghost of his own creation, because he didn't have the courage to accept that his parents were disappearing in the most natural way in the world. It was during that single second that Denise appeared in the doorway. She stood there in a silk robe, her hair loose, her face carefully shaped by a grief made to fit her perfectly, and her voice rose with a gentleness so complete that it became cruel. You see now, Cole. She entered the room and placed a hand on her nephew's shoulder as though supporting him. I didn't want to say this, but you can see it for yourself. The music box was destroyed, and Frank and Maggie are still the same. That leaves only 2 possibilities. The first is that it's the illness, exactly as every doctor said from the beginning, and that device had nothing to do with any of it. She paused for precisely 1 beat. The second, and I'm frightened even to consider it, is that the device wasn't the only one. Someone may have installed another after accidentally discovering the first, so the performance wouldn't end too soon. She didn't look at Tessa. She didn't need to. The entire room looked in her place. The old couple's screams gradually weakened into exhausted moans, following the same merciless pattern of 20 minutes. And in the drained silence that followed, Cole slowly turned his head toward the doorway where Tessa stood. 40 hours without sleep, 8 weeks of exhaustion, and now this final blow. His face was no longer a frozen lake. It was a lake that had cracked. I'm not dismissing you, he said. Every word as heavy as stone. But beginning tomorrow morning, you aren't to enter my parents' room alone. Changing the sheets, giving medication, checking their blood pressure. Whatever you do, one of Fitz's men must be in the room. He finished speaking and turned away without waiting for her answer. then bent down and lifted his mother into his trembling arms. Tessa lowered her head and withdrew. She crossed the dark hallway to the small room in the staff quarters, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in darkness. She remained there for a long time, her hands clasped tightly together, allowing the hurt to rise before forcing it back down, because hurt feelings were a luxury she didn't have time for now. Then she began doing what she had always done best during her years working night shifts at the old facility. She arranged the facts beside one another as carefully as pills placed into a tray. For 8 consecutive nights after the music box had been destroyed, there hadn't been a single scream. Tonight, the screaming returned at exactly 3 o'clock, lasted exactly 20 minutes, and produced every identical symptom. So what was different tonight from the 8 nights before? It wasn't the medication. The medication hadn't changed. It wasn't the room. She had personally searched every centimeter. It wasn't an outsider. The mansion gates hadn't admitted a single guest in 8 days. Except for one person. The final pill dropped into its proper compartment, and Tessa felt the back of her neck turn cold. The only difference between 8 peaceful nights and tonight's hell was that Denise Ashford Cray was sleeping inside this house. That meant there was a second device, and if it had remained silent for 8 days, only to awaken tonight while Denise was present, then it wasn't controlled by a timer. Someone had turned it on by hand. The next morning, Denise announced that she would stay for a few more days to help Frank and Maggie through this difficult period, and no one in the house objected, not even Cole. One of Fitz's men began standing inside the old couple's room whenever Tessa entered to change the sheets or administer medication, a man as broad as a wardrobe who watched every movement she made with his arms folded in silence, and Tessa worked beneath that gaze with her neck straight and her fingers steady, even though something inside her was burning. All that day, she wrestled with herself. Tell Cole, that was her first thought. Tell him about the pattern of 8 nights, about the second device, about how it had been activated by hand. But what evidence did she have? A chain of deductions spoken by a nurse whom the owner of the house had just forbidden from entering the patient's room alone. Someone already standing at the top of the list of suspects, a woman whose dismissal record had just been dragged into the open before the entire household. Denise had moved one perfect step ahead of her. Anything Tessa said now would sound like the thrashing of a fish already laid upon the cutting board. And the harder it struggled, the more clearly it revealed its fear. No, words were dead inside this house. She needed something no one could dispute. And she knew it existed, because Kowalski himself had said so in that room before dawn. The camera inside the device transmitted images wirelessly within a radius of 60 meters, which meant that somewhere within 60 meters of the old couple's bedroom, a receiver was storing everything. Every night, every minute, every strip of footage from 8 weeks of hell. Whoever was behind this hadn't merely tormented them. That person had sat and watched, and whatever was used for watching had to remain within reach. The guest wing where Denise was staying stood fewer than 40 steps from the old couple's bedroom. When night fell, Tessa sat in her small room without turning on the light, and in that darkness, for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to return to another room in another city, where a thin woman lay on a narrow bed beside a window. Her mother had become ill at 49, early-onset Alzheimer's disease, a prison sentence without a verdict, and for 3 years, her 22-year-old daughter studied, worked, and walked through everything alone. The nights when her mother stayed awake, calling the names of people long dead, the afternoons when she looked at Tessa and asked who she was and why she was being so kind to her, the stacks of medical bills growing thicker with every passing month. Then came a period when her mother sank almost completely into stupor, sleeping through entire days, her eyes open but with no one left behind them, and Tessa, still a nursing student who believed doctors were always right, had noticed that the sedative dosage on the prescription was unusually high. She had seen it. She had wondered. She had nearly asked. Then she had remained silent. Who was an unlicensed girl to question a respected physician? She said nothing for 4 months. By the time she found the courage to speak, the last remnants of her mother's clarity had already been worn away beyond recovery. And those 4 months, 4 months in which her mother might still have recognized her daughter, had been stolen by Tessa's own silence. Her mother died on a winter morning, and aboard the bus leaving the cemetery, 25-year-old Tessa Ward made herself a promise, one that would later cost her a job, nearly cost her license, and destroy her place in the profession. Never again would she remain silent when she knew something was wrong. She had paid for that promise once. This time, she thought in the darkness, as her hands gradually stopped trembling. This time would be no different. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the family hallway sank into the kind of silence found only in houses too large for the people sleeping inside them. Tessa stood before the guest room door with the spare key in her apron pocket. The key the housekeeper had given her during her first days there so she could clean the rooms, and her heart struck her ribs with blows as heavy as a hammer. She knew exactly what she was standing before. The family wing, where Cole's orders forbade her to wander. The room of an honored guest. And if that door opened and someone caught her inside, no explanation would save her. This wouldn't mean merely losing her job. It would mean something far worse inside a house where the law stopped at the gates. She looked down at the gap beneath the door. The strip of light had disappeared 20 minutes earlier. She raised the key toward the lock, and at that exact moment, her ears caught a sound, the doorknob turning from inside. Tessa darted into the recess beside the hallway cabinet and held her breath. The door opened. Denise stepped out in her silk robe, leaving the hallway lights off, and moved toward the staircase with the footsteps of someone who knew this house even better than its owner. From the kitchen below came the sound of water filling a kettle. Then the click of the stove. She was making tea. A few minutes, perhaps 10, perhaps less. Tessa didn't allow herself time to be afraid. She slipped through the unlocked door, closed it behind her, and switched on the small flashlight on her telephone, covering part of the beam with her palm. The room was so immaculate that it felt unnerving. The blanket lay folded with edges as straight as a ruler. The pillows were arranged at perfect angles. The clothes inside the wardrobe hung in order from the palest shades to the darkest. The perfume bottle and jewelry box on the dressing table stood in a flawless line. It was a room without a single trace of a human being, containing only order, the order of a mind that controlled every centimeter around it. Tessa forced herself to think like that mind. The wardrobe was too obvious. Anyone searching would open it first. The bathroom was too damp for electronics. A desk drawer could be touched by a housekeeper at any time. The suitcase had a combination lock, but a suitcase would be the first thing searched if anything went wrong. What remained? Her flashlight stopped on the perfectly made bed, a place no one touched except the person sleeping there. A place where the housekeeper changed only the top sheets. A place where someone could check a possession every night while lying directly above it. Tessa dropped to her knees, slid her hand into the gap between the mattress and the bed frame, and moved her palm along the edge, one handspan at a time. Roughly 1/3 of the way down from the headboard, her fingers stopped. Something hard, flat, and thin rested inside the mattress. She brought the light close to the seam and saw it. A line of thread in a slightly different shade running for roughly 2 handspans. Skillful enough to look like part of the original stitching at a glance, but the stitches were looser and newer than the rest. Her heartbeat thundered against her eardrums. Tessa slipped her fingers between the 2 edges of fabric, pulled the seam apart, and withdrew a thin, ice-cold sheet of metal wrapped in a black leather case from inside the mattress. A tablet. She turned it over in her sweating hands, pressed the power button, and the screen flared to life in the darkness, casting a pale blue glow across her face along with a single quiet message, "Enter passcode." Footsteps echoed up from the staircase. Tessa froze, the tablet still in her hands, its screen still glowing with the demand for a passcode, and in a fraction of a second, her mind raced through every possible escape. The main door was useless because the footsteps were already too close. Beneath the bed was too dangerous because Denise's robe might brush the floor. The wardrobe door would creak when opened. That left the window curtains, 2 heavy layers of wine-colored velvet hanging all the way to the floor. She turned off the screen, pressed the tablet against her chest, slipped into the narrow space between the curtain and the window frame, and had barely become still when the doorknob turned. Denise entered, carrying a steaming cup of tea in one hand. She didn't switch on the main light, only turned the small bedside lamp, and through a gap between the curtains, no wider than a thread, Tessa watched her set the tea on the table, remove her diamond earrings, and place them inside the jewelry box, every movement unhurried and exact, without a single wasted second. Then the telephone inside the pocket of her robe began to vibrate. Denise looked at the screen, answered, and when her voice rose inside the darkened room, Tessa felt the blood in her body reverse direction, because it was no longer the sweet voice of a devoted aunt. It was bare, flat, and cold as steel. "I'm listening." A pause followed. "No, they haven't found anything yet. The boy is having the components analyzed. It'll be several days before they have an answer. And even if they trace the workshop, there are still 3 intermediaries between the workshop and me. That trail was severed a long time ago. She took a sip of tea and moved slowly toward the window, drawing closer with every step until Tessa could hear the faint tap of the silver spoon against the cup on the other side of the curtain, less than an arm's length from her face. "That isn't the problem," Denise continued. "The problem is the little nurse. She's starting to look at me in that way." Tessa held her breath until her chest ached, her heart beating so hard that she feared the sound might pass through the velvet, the way someone looks when they've caught the scent but haven't found the body. The person on the other end said something, and Denise gave a low, dry laugh. No, she won't dare tell the boy. What would she tell him? Who would believe her? I nailed her to the wall Sunday afternoon, but I don't like letting a risk continue breathing for long. Another silence followed, longer this time, and then Denise delivered each word like the final stamp on a document. "Here's what we'll do. Move the evaluation forward. Don't wait another 3 weeks. Call the office first thing tomorrow morning. Tell them the patient's condition has deteriorated suddenly after a security incident inside the house, and request an emergency appointment. This week. Yes, this week. Within the next few days. Last night was a gift from heaven. The entire household witnessed it. The sooner we close the file, the better." Before another variable appears, Tessa felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. 3 weeks, the deadline Cole and Fitz had been relying on while they laid their trap, had just been cut down to a few days by a telephone call made at 1 o'clock in the morning, with only a curtain separating Tessa from the woman making it. "Once it's done, I'll transfer the rest," Denise said, her voice softening into smoke. "Now I need to sleep. Tomorrow I still have to continue playing the aunt who can't rest because she's so worried about her brother and sister-in-law." She ended the call. Tessa heard the teacup settle onto its porcelain saucer, the rustle of silk, then footsteps moving away and the bathroom door closing, followed by the steady sound of running water. She counted to 5 in her head, and didn't allow herself to count any longer. Then she slipped out from behind the curtain, crossed the room with every step balanced on the balls of her feet, closed the door behind her as softly as a breath, and moved through the dark hallway toward her own room with the tablet pressed against her chest like a second heart. Once inside, she locked the door and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. Only then did her hands begin to tremble, trembling late, as though fear had been forced to stand in line and wait for its turn. She switched on the screen. Enter passcode. 4 empty boxes waited in silence. Tessa searched her memory for Denise's birthday. She had seen it on the birthday card displayed in the sitting room the previous month. She entered the 4 numbers. The screen vibrated. Incorrect. She tried 1, 2, 3, 4. The passcode of people who believed no one would ever dare touch their belongings. Incorrect. This time, beneath the 4 empty boxes, a small red warning appeared that made Tessa's stomach tighten. 1 attempt remaining. The device will lock permanently and erase all data. She rested the tablet on her lap, both palms slick with sweat. 1 attempt. 8 weeks of hell suffered by the old couple. The entire truth. Her own life inside this house. All of it compressed into a single touch of her finger. "Think," she ordered herself. "Think like her. A mind that arranged clothing by color and perfume bottles in straight lines. A mind that never chose anything at random. The passcode of a woman like that wouldn't be a convenient number. It would have meaning. And to someone who had carried hatred powerful enough to do all of this, what held more meaning than anything else in her life? At that moment, from the deepest corner of Tessa's memory, a dry, bony hand closed around her wrist once more, and a rough voice whispered across all the days and nights between them. "Denny broke my wooden horse. Then she cried first, so Mother would punish me. June 19th. She always cried first. June 19th. The entire room seemed to fall silent. Tessa looked down at the 4 empty boxes, fully aware that what she was about to do wasn't deduction. It was a wager. A wager placing everything upon a sentence the entire world would dismiss as the rambling of an old man with dementia, upon her own belief that when a mind was falling apart, the last things it released weren't meaningless, but the memories carved deepest into it. That the man who had forgotten his own son's face still remembered perfectly the day his younger sister revealed who she truly was, and that somewhere on the other side of that memory, the sister had never forgotten that day either, the day everything began, buried so deeply within her that she had carved it into the object she looked at every night. Tessa's finger hovered above the screen for 1 second, then 2. She always cried first. Tessa pressed the numbers. 0, 6, 1. 9. A single heartbeat stretched as long as a lifetime. Then the 4 boxes disappeared, and the screen opened. Tessa clapped one hand over her mouth to stop the sound that nearly escaped. Half a sob, half a silent laugh, and in the darkness of the small staff room, she sat trembling before a truth that sent both cold and grief along her spine. That the man everyone in the house pitied because he couldn't remember his son's name had turned out to be the only person in the mansion who still remembered exactly who his sister truly was. The home screen appeared, sparsely arranged with a few familiar icons, and in the center, without even an attempt at concealment, sat a folder labeled Surveillance, marked at the corner by a bright red number like a wax seal. 900 unread notifications. Tessa touched the surveillance folder, and the door to hell opened on a screen no wider than her hand. The first thing that appeared was an activity log. Hundreds of lines stacked with perfect regularity like shovel strokes digging a grave. 3 o'clock in the morning, activated, 22 minutes. 3 o'clock in the morning, activated, 21 minutes. 3 o'clock in the morning, activated, 23 minutes. Day after day, week after week, not a single night missed over the course of 8 weeks, each line representing another night when 2 people in their 70s had been forced down into a terror the entire world insisted they had imagined. Tessa scrolled backward, and her finger began to slow when she realized the log didn't begin on the night the first screams had echoed through the mansion. It went back 3 weeks earlier, to entries that were shorter and farther apart, written in a different kind of language. Test run, 1, 5 minutes, volume at 40%, no observable response. Test run 3, 8 minutes, frequency increased, subject F turned over. Test run 7, 12 minutes, lowered to 18 Hz. Both subjects awakened. Signs of agitation observed. Effective. Preserve this threshold. Whoever had done this hadn't rushed straight into tormenting them. That person had experimented, patiently testing each level of frequency, every degree of volume, every minute of duration, upon 2 aging bodies, as someone might tune a musical instrument, until the exact pitch of hell had been found. Tessa opened the video folder. The screen filled with gray squares arranged by date, each square representing one night. She touched one near the middle, and the old couple's bedroom appeared in the moss-green tint of night vision, the camera looking down from above the headboard, 2 silver heads sleeping peacefully below. The clock in the corner of the screen changed to exactly 3 o'clock, and as though an invisible hand had jerked them awake, both bodies sprang upright at once. Frank pressed his fists against his temples, his mouth opening in a scream that the muted tablet speakers reduced to silent movements, and that silence made it even more horrifying. Maggie shrank against the headboard, her shoulders jerking again and again, while the lens continued watching from above, calm and unblinking, recording all 22 minutes of suffering into its memory. Tessa had to turn her eyes away from the screen for a moment, her teeth clenched tightly, because she suddenly understood the true horror of what she was seeing. This wasn't the first time the recording had been watched. The person behind it had watched it first, sitting somewhere in the darkness with a cup of tea, opening it night after night, as though following a serial drama of their own creation. Beneath every recording was a written note, and the notes chilled Tessa more deeply than the images because they were composed in the language of a research file. Recording 51. Subject M responded beyond expectations. Recovery period prolonged. Subject F showed a noticeable increase in daytime confusion. Has begun using incorrect names for relatives in the morning. Progress satisfactory. Preserve current schedule. Evaluation next month. Subject M, Subject F, not Maggie, not Frank, not my brother and sister-in-law. Only Subject M and Subject F, 2 specimens inside a procedure. And Tessa finally understood the deepest truth of what had been happening. Understood it with a clarity that made her stomach twist. This had never been simple cruelty driven by hatred. Hatred was hot. This was cold. This was a production line. The material entering at one end was 2 people who could still smile and remember. The product emerging from the other was a flawless medical record. Every night of terror was converted into another line of diagnosis. Every episode of daytime confusion became another expert signature. At the end of the process, the court would receive an immaculate finished product, bearing the names of 2 elderly people declared incapable of managing their own affairs. She continued scrolling, and among the dry folders of data, she found a single personal note with no title. Tessa opened it. The first line struck her immediately. June 19th. Father chose. She sat perfectly still. Below it were passages of varying length written across many years, as though someone had been writing into a wound. June 19th. Father called both of us into the study and gave everything to Frank. Father said a daughter would someday have a husband to provide for her. June 19th. I stood outside the door and listened without crying. From that day forward, I swore I would never cry real tears again. Tears are tools, nothing more. Near the end was another line, written not long ago, its meaning still fresh even in the cold light of electronic text. People think I hate Frank. I don't. I'm only taking back what belongs to me, with interest. The interest will be paid in the thing Father valued most in him, his sound mind. Tessa released a trembling breath. The passcode had never been a coincidence. June 19th wasn't merely a date. It was the identity of that woman, an old wound sharpened every day into a blade. And Frank, the old man the entire world believed had already fallen apart, had preserved that fateful date perfectly in the deepest place the disease had not yet reached. He had preserved the true nature of his younger sister, the nature he had first seen when she stood beside the broken wooden horse. Tessa was about to exit the folder and create a backup when her eyes caught the first line at the top of the activity log, the most recent entry, recorded a little more than an hour earlier, and all the blood in her body seemed to drain into her feet. Manual activation, 3 o'clock. Duration, 20 minutes. Backup device. Location, wedding portrait frame. Wedding portrait frame. Tessa closed her eyes and saw it clearly in her mind. The gold-plated frame holding the black and white photograph of Frank and Maggie on their wedding day, the gift Denise had brought at the same time as the music box 2 months earlier. I restored it from the original film, she had said. Hang it above the bed so the two of you can always see each other. It had hung there ever since, directly above the two pillows, less than an arm's length from their silver heads, innocent and silent, watching everything. It had watched the night Tessa searched every centimeter of the room without once looking up at it. It had watched Cole sit guard beside his parents' bed. It had watched the doctors examine them beneath it. The second monster had never been hiding. It had been hanging in plain sight, smiling with the wedding day faces of its own victims. Tessa opened her eyes, and the final pieces locked together with an icy certainty. The 8 silent nights had been meant to convince the entire house that destroying the music box had ended everything. Then, last night, when another descent into hell was needed to turn that certainty into suspicion and place the blame upon Tessa, the same hand had reached through this tablet and touched a button from inside the house. She had to bring this to Cole immediately, regardless of the hour, regardless of his orders, regardless of anything. 3 knocks sounded in the night, dry and precise, directly behind her. Tessa sprang to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat, and shoved the tablet beneath the pillow in a reflex so quick that even she had no time to think. 3 more knocks came, followed by a deep, hoarse voice through the door. Tessa, open the door. I know you're still awake. It was Cole. She drew a long breath, smoothed the front of her clothes, and pulled back the bolt. The man standing in the dark hallway looked like a tower whose foundations had been torn away. He was still wearing the same clothes he had worn that afternoon, his jaw covered in rough stubble, the hollows beneath his eyes so deep that even the nightlight spilling from her room couldn't reach them. Tessa understood immediately that he hadn't slept at all, that since the night the screaming returned, this man had been sitting alone with thoughts that were tearing him in half. I can't sleep, Cole said, his voice low and stripped bare by exhaustion. I've spent the past 2 nights pacing through my study, arranging everything from every possible angle, and no matter how I arrange it, one piece never fits. He looked directly into her eyes. There was no strength left in his gaze to intimidate her, only an urgency that came close to pleading. So I'm asking you once, only this once, and I need the truth, not because I want to accuse you, but because if I suspect the wrong person, my parents will pay the price. Tell me the truth. Was it you? Tessa opened her mouth, and at that exact moment, a frightened cry tore down the hallway. There's a thief. Cole. Someone broke into my room. Denise came rushing toward them in her silk robe, her hair disheveled just enough, her breathing quickened just enough. One hand pressed over her heart in precisely the right place. Someone entered my room. My things were searched. Something is missing. Her eyes swept past Cole's shoulder and locked onto Tessa standing behind the partly open door, then widened as though every piece had suddenly fallen into place before her. It was you. Cole turned halfway around. What happened? What's missing? I don't know everything yet, Denise said, her voice trembling at exactly the proper degree. But someone entered my room. I can feel it. My belongings have been moved. And Cole, think about it. Who else in this house is awake at this hour? Who has keys to every room? Who has been driven so far into a corner that she might do something desperate? She pointed directly at Tessa. Search her room. Right now. If I'm wrong, I'll kneel and apologize to her in front of you. But if I'm right, you'll finally know who has been poisoning this house. The hallway held its breath. Cole stood between the two women, and Tessa saw the final struggle on his exhausted face. On one side stood the aunt, who had held him from the day he was born. On the other stood a nurse who had been in the house for only 5 months, a woman with a stained employment record. Every reasonable argument in the world stood on one side, and Tessa understood that the moment she had both awaited and feared from the beginning had arrived. There was no way around it, nowhere left to hide. The only path remaining was straight through. She pushed the door fully open, stood upright in the doorway, and spoke with a calmness that surprised even her. There's no need to search. Yes, I entered her room. A flash of triumph appeared in Denise's eyes, disguised as shock, while Cole recoiled as though another blow had struck a wound that hadn't yet healed. Tessa continued, each word falling clearly onto the stone floor. I didn't take jewelry. I didn't take money. I didn't touch anything that belonged to her. I took something that never belonged to her in the first place. She turned back into the room, pulled the tablet from beneath the pillow, and held it up beneath the hallway light. I took this. It was sewn inside her mattress, and it contains 8 weeks of hell suffered by your parents. Denise's face froze for 1/10 of a second. Then the machine inside her shifted gears with terrifying smoothness. That is my personal use for why did, she said, her voice changing from alarm to the outrage of someone whose privacy had been violated. She broke into my room, tore through my private belongings, and now she's standing here making accusations. Cole, can't you see? She has become this desperate. Who knows what she placed on that device? These days, creating a false recording or copying a few files onto someone else's machine is something even a child can do. She had the entire night to prepare it before staging this performance. Every sentence was another stroke of an oar steering the boat of suspicion back toward its former course, and Tessa felt the terrifying force of this woman, her ability to turn every truth into a weapon aimed back at the person who spoke it. But Cole wasn't looking at the tablet. He stood very still, and inside the mind of a man who had survived his entire life by reading the cracks in other people, one small detail had caught like a fishbone amid the storm of exhaustion and doubt. Slowly, he raised his eyes to his aunt and asked, not loudly, not threateningly, but with a deliberate calm that chilled the skin. Wait, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. The light in your room has been off for hours. Your jewelry is still inside the box on the table. No money is missing. Your suitcase hasn't been disturbed. The only thing gone is an object sewn shut inside the mattress beneath your back, hidden from sight. He took one step toward her. So how did you know something was missing at 2 o'clock in the morning, unless you had just reached beneath the mattress to look for it? A deadly silence fell over the hallway. Tessa saw it, the moment she would remember forever. The first and only time the perfect machine called Denise Ashford Cray stumbled. Her lips parted before her mind could approve the words. I check it every night before I... The unfinished sentence snapped in the air like an instrument string pulled too tight. Before you what? Cole asked, still speaking in that same slow voice. What do you check every night, Aunt Denise? Denise closed her mouth. 1 second passed, then 2. What I meant was, she said at last. I heard a sound and woke up to inspect the room, but it was too late. Everyone in the hallway had heard the first half of her sentence, and those words couldn't be taken back. Tessa didn't allow the moment to cool. She stepped forward and placed the tablet in Cole's hand. It's unlocked, she said quietly. I don't need you to believe me. I never did. Open the surveillance folder. Watch your parents in those recordings. Read the notes beneath every night. Then decide for yourself whom to believe. Cole looked down at the glowing screen in his hand, and Tessa played her final card, her voice carrying clearly through the hallway so the third person would hear every word. And if you need evidence that no one in this world could have planted, evidence that is hung in one place for 2 months directly before all our eyes, then come with me to your parents' bedroom, right now. Cole looked at Tessa for 1 long second, then turned and walked toward the far end of the hallway, with the tablet clenched tightly in his hand. And that was his answer. Tessa followed immediately behind him, while Denise, after a moment of standing rooted to the floor, hurried after them. Throughout the 40 steps along the dark hallway, her voice clung to the two of them like a cord tightening with every word. "Cole, what are you doing? Are you really going to let a servant lead you around in the middle of the night? Frank and Maggie have just endured a terrible episode. They need peace and quiet. If you burst into their room now, you'll only hurt them. Cole, stop and listen to me. That girl knows every corner of that room. She has had 5 months to place anything she wanted inside it, and then pretend to discover it. Doesn't this performance seem familiar to you? It's exactly what she did with the music box." Cole's footsteps continued striking the hallway carpet at the same steady rhythm, neither quickening nor slowing, until all three of them stopped before the old couple's bedroom door. By then, Denise's voice had risen an entire pitch, control slipping from the final words. "I forbid you to open that door." Cole placed his hand on the doorknob, turned his head toward his aunt, and said only one thing. "You forbid me from entering my parents' room." Then he pushed the door open. The bedroom rested beneath the pale gold glow of the night lamp, and on the bed, the old couple lay sleeping in the positions of people who had been completely drained. Frank faced the ceiling, his breathing shallow and rough. Maggie lay curled on her side, one hand still reaching toward her husband, even in sleep. Their aged faces still carried the marks of the 3 o'clock torment, and above their silver heads, within the dim pool of light, the gold-plated wedding portrait hung silently on the wall. The black and white photograph showed a tall young man in formal clothes and a radiant bride smiling beneath her veil. Those two young people looking down at themselves 60 years later, watching every night, including the nights of hell. Tessa walked forward, removed her slippers, stepped onto the edge of the bed near the headboard, and lifted the portrait from its hook with both hands, as carefully as though she were handling a bomb. She carried it to the medicine table beside the window and placed it face down. Cole switched on the desk lamp. Denise remained in the doorway without entering, one hand gripping the frame, and Tessa noticed that she didn't ask what they were doing or why they were taking down the portrait. An innocent person would have asked. Denise didn't. She only stood there watching, like someone witnessing the final piece on her board being pushed toward a fatal square with no way to reach out and stop it. The back of the frame was covered by a brown panel held in place with small rotating clips. Tessa turned each one aside, and the moment the panel loosened, she knew, because it was heavier than any ordinary backing should have been. She took the small letter opener from her apron pocket, the object she had carried ever since the night she tore open the music box. A new habit born from suspicion, cut along the inner edge of the backing, slipped 2 fingers beneath it, and pulled. The layer came loose. No one in the room breathed. Resting inside a hollow carved into the pressed wood behind the portrait, secured with black adhesive, was a device all 3 people in the room recognized immediately. It was an exact duplicate of the first device, the same compact circuit board, the coin-sized speaker, and a hidden lens disguised within the frame's ornate border. Its red indicator light pulsing slowly in the dark. Silence crashed over the room like an avalanche, thick, cold, and bottomless. The only sounds were the rough breathing of the 2 elderly people on the bed and the heartbeats of the 3 people standing nearby. Cole stared at the device for a long time. Then he raised the tablet, its screen still displaying the activity log, and read the first line aloud in a voice that no longer belonged to an exhausted man. Manual activation. 3 o'clock last night. Duration. 20 minutes. Backup device. Location. Wedding portrait frame. He lowered the tablet, and the words that followed came one at a time, slow and even, like nails being driven into the lid of a coffin. No one could plant a file inside an object that has been hanging on this wall for 2 months. No one could fabricate recordings that match the device blinking in front of me. The exact model, the exact components, every entry in the machine. And no one in this world. He raised his eyes, his gaze crossing the room and fastening onto the woman in the doorway, could have pressed the manual activation button at 3 o'clock last night, except someone sleeping inside this house, within arm's reach of the receiver, on the only night you stayed here after 8 peaceful nights. The exact night you needed my parents to start screaming again so everyone would believe the music box had been innocent, so every suspicion would fall upon the nurse. And you needed it quickly, desperately, before my analysis team traced the components, before the path from some workshop led directly to your door. A reckless move by someone running out of time. He placed the tablet on the table beside the device, the 2 pieces of evidence lying together beneath the lamp, like the 2 halves of a pair of handcuffs. Last night, it was your lifeline. Tonight, it's your noose. Denise stepped backward from the doorway, and Tessa, who had watched that face for 2 months and counted every mask appearing and disappearing with the precision of a clock, saw for the first time what lay beneath them all. Because for the first time, Denise's face had no time to arrange itself. The muscles had gone rigid. The corners of her mouth sagged. Her eyes darted rapidly from the device to the tablet and then to her nephew's face, searching for an escape, a crack, some phrase that might save her, and finding nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was only a 60-year-old woman standing alone in the dark hallway after the entire scenery of her performance had collapsed around her. Maggie shifted on the bed and made a small sound in her sleep. Cole lowered his voice immediately at the sound, but that only made his next words more frightening than any roar. Downstairs. To the study. Fitz is on his way. Fitz arrived within 20 minutes, bringing 2 more men who moved silently through the house with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to cleaning up problems. Denise was escorted downstairs to the study. No one touched her, and no one needed to. She still held herself upright with her chin raised, settling into the leather chair across from Cole's desk, with both hands resting neatly in her lap like a lady waiting to be served tea. On the oak surface between them lay the tablet and the device removed from the wedding portrait, placed side by side beneath the light. Tessa stood in the corner, where Cole had indicated with a tilt of his head that she should remain, while Fitz and his men blocked the doorway. Cole didn't raise his voice. He drew the tablet closer, opened the activity log, and began to read in a flat voice without rise or fall. The voice Tessa had come to recognize as the most frightening of all the voices this man possessed, the voice of a sentence being passed. May 15th, 3 o'clock in the morning, activated, 18 minutes. May 16th, 3 o'clock in the morning, activated, 20 minutes. May 17th, May 18th, May 19th. He moved through every line and read every night aloud, each number falling into the room like a drop of water striking stone, steady and unending, until the very regularity of it became a form of torture. Then he moved to the written notes. Recording 51. Subject M responded beyond expectations. Subject F showed increased daytime confusion. Progress satisfactory. Evaluation next month. He looked up. Subject M is my mother, he said. Subject F is my father. Denise didn't blink. I don't know where that machine came from, she said, her composure returning with astonishing ease. Listen to yourself, Cole. A tablet that girl admits she stole from my room. Who can be certain she didn't type those entries herself? She's a nurse. She knows every medical term. Subject M, Subject F. Those words exist in her mind, not mine. Are you truly prepared to condemn your father's own sister on the word of someone who broke into another person's room in the middle of the night? She denied everything, and Tessa had to admit privately that even after her entire scheme had collapsed, the woman still denied it so smoothly that if Tessa hadn't read the personal note with her own eyes, even she might have wavered. Cole listened without interrupting, waiting until Denise's final sentence had fallen away into silence. Then he spoke. Are you finished? He touched the screen and opened another folder, an audio folder Tessa hadn't had time to examine because the camera inside the device hadn't merely recorded images. It had captured sound as well, everything spoken inside the bedroom and in the hallway beyond it throughout those 2 months. He pressed play. The tablet's small speaker crackled once. Then, amid the low background noise of a dark hallway, a voice emerged, clear, unhurried, and unmistakable, the voice of the woman sitting in the leather chair. Are they still screaming? How pitiful. My brother once brought all of Chicago to its knees, and now he can't even soothe his own father back to sleep. Denise sat rigidly upright. Cole didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the screen and opened the next recording. A longer one. A telephone conversation captured in the hallway outside his parents' bedroom. This time, Denise's recorded voice was completely bare, stripped of every mask, discussing the plan with someone on the other end in the cold tone of a woman reading a balance sheet. Move both of them into Lakeview as soon as the court makes its ruling. A private suite in the special wing. $30,000 a month. Therapy and equipment billed separately. Every invoice will be legitimate, because the guardian has full authority to pay care expenses from the assets of the people under guardianship. Where the trust money ultimately flows depends entirely on the person administering it. Then the voice sharpened. Move the evaluation forward. Don't wait 3 weeks. This week. The sooner we close the file, the better. The recording ended. The room became so still that Tessa could hear the clock on the wall and the blood beating inside her own ears. $30,000 a month. Lakeview. The trust. Details no nurse could have invented. Numbers that could only have come from the mouth of the person who had built the entire plan, now echoing in Denise's own voice inside the study of the man whose parents she had intended to steal away. Cole set the tablet down and looked at his aunt with an expression Tessa had never seen before. It wasn't anger. He had passed beyond anger long ago. It was final recognition, cold and painful. Across the desk, something inside Denise Ashford Cray gave way. It wasn't a loud collapse, but the quiet surrender of someone who had exhausted every card in her hand. Her shoulders lowered, and when she spoke, even her voice had changed. There was no sweetness left in it, no trembling, only bitterness that had been fermenting for 60 years. "You want to know," she said, raising her eyes to her nephew. "Do you know what June 19th means? That was the day Father called us into his study and gave everything to Frank. Everything. The family name, the business, this house. And what did I receive? One sentence. A daughter will someday have a husband to provide for her. I was 18 years old, and I was erased from my own family simply because I had been born a girl." She gave a dry laugh. "I'm the one who lived decently in this family. I built 3 facilities with my own hands, legally and cleanly, while my brother stained his hands with blood across this city to protect an empire Father handed to him without making him shed a single drop of sweat. And that trust?" she said, her eyes flashing with one last trace of contempt. "Half of that 20 million should have belonged to me. Instead, he married a waitress and left everything to her. What does that waitress know about protecting money? What does she know about?" Cole's fist crashed onto the oak desk. A dry crack split along the grain, and Denise fell silent. Cole rose very slowly, braced both hands against the fractured surface, and leaned toward his aunt. When he spoke, his voice was flat once more, but beneath that flatness lay something that made even Fitz turn his eyes away from the doorway. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "My father's sister is dead. She died on the first night you sat down and pressed the button that activated that machine inside your brother's bedroom." He straightened. "The thing sitting in front of me isn't my aunt. It's a stranger who crawled into my home and tortured my parents for 2 months, night after night, then documented their suffering as though they were 2 laboratory animals. And I deal with strangers in my own way." Fitz took Denise out of the house before dawn. She didn't scream or beg. She simply rose from the leather chair when Cole tilted his head, wrapped the silk robe around her shoulders, as though putting on the last scraps of dignity she had left, and walked into the hallway between 2 of Fitz's men, her heels striking the marble floor in a steady rhythm, growing fainter and fainter until the sound vanished completely after a car door closed outside on the gravel drive. Tessa stood beside the study window and watched 2 red taillights glide through the gates, sink into the darkness along the lake, and disappear. She didn't ask where they were taking Denise. In this house, there were questions wise people learned never to ask, and Cole offered no explanation. He simply stood for a long time beside the oak desk with its fresh crack, staring at the 2 pieces of evidence lying motionless beneath the lamp, then told Fitz to put them somewhere safe. "We still have a use for these." 3 days later, the city of Chicago absorbed several small changes that no one cared enough to notice. Denise Ashford Cray's luxury apartment was returned to its owner, cleaned so thoroughly that not even a single strand of hair remained. Her bank accounts were closed one by one. The 3 high-end nursing homes bearing her name, including the Lakeview facility on the shore, were transferred in full to a charitable trust dedicated to elderly care through procedures so swift and legally precise that the attorneys had little more to do than sign their names. According to the official records filed everywhere such records needed to exist, Mrs. Cray had left for an extended journey through South America to rest and receive medical treatment, with no return date planned. No one called to ask after her. No one filed a report. In Cole Ashford's world, when a name quietly vanished from the books in that manner, people understood that it belonged to the kind of question one survived longer by knowing less about, and so no one wanted to know. The rest was cleaned up neatly in daylight. The petition, expressing concern that had been filed with family court, was quietly withdrawn by the law firm on the grounds that its client had changed her mind. Dr. Simmons, after a brief meeting whose contents were never recorded anywhere, personally signed a corrected diagnosis and sent the family a written apology, acknowledging that he had failed to identify the physical cause behind the clinical symptoms. A new medical team, chosen by Tessa from among the former colleagues she still trusted, people who placed patients before paperwork, was brought in to take over the old couple's care. But the most memorable afternoon of those 3 days didn't unfold in the study or inside a lawyer's office. It took place on the back veranda, where the lawn sloped gently toward the water, during one of those rare moments when the fog inside Frank's mind lifted for a little while. Cole sat beside his father on the long wooden bench facing the lake. He said nothing. He simply sat there, something he had never made time to do during all the years he had spent building his empire. Lake Michigan was calm that afternoon, the final sunlight spreading across the water in a broad band of molten gold, and Frank remained quiet for a long time, both hands resting on his lap, his eyes fixed on the distance. Then the old man turned toward his son, his gaze suddenly clear, the gaze of someone who was truly present, and he asked in a slow but steady voice, "Where is Denny, son? I haven't seen her visit in a long time." Cole was silent for a moment. He looked at his father, the man whose name had once inspired fear throughout the city, now sitting beside him small and gentle beneath the afternoon sun, and chose the simplest and kindest words he possessed. "She went far away, Dad. Very far away." Frank listened, then slowly nodded, and turned his eyes back toward the lake, following a white sailboat drifting near the horizon. He sat that way for a while, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost weightless, as though he were speaking to himself, to the water, or to something he had known for a very long time and had never truly stopped knowing. "Yes," he said. "She always cried first." Then he reached for his son's hand and held it, and father and son remained that way beside the lake until the golden light faded from the water. Neither of them spoke another word, and neither of them needed to. They began renovating the bedroom that very week. Maggie was shown a fan of paint samples spread before her like a peacock's tail, and the old woman ran her finger across the colors for a while before stopping at a warm shade of yellow. She pointed to it and laughed with the clear, bright laughter of a young girl. "It looks like morning sunlight on the lake," she said. And so the 4 walls of the bedroom were dressed in that color of sunshine. When the new cream curtains patterned with pale flowers and leaves were hung and drawn open, Frank sat in his chair watching them sway in the breeze, drifting through the partly opened window. Then he nodded to himself. "They look like the fields when I was young," he said, only that one sentence, and Tessa, who was arranging a stack of towels nearby, had to turn away to hide the smile that had risen into the corners of her eyes. But there was one task in the new room that Tessa refused to give to anyone else, and she wouldn't allow anyone to take it from her. Cole had offered to hire a full security company equipped with specialized scanners to examine every object before it entered his parents' bedroom. Modern machines capable of seeing through every layer of fabric and wood, fast and reliable. Tessa shook her head. She sat at the table beside the window beneath the brilliant light of a desk lamp, armed with a small screwdriver, a seam ripper, and the patience of someone who had learned through blood that certain things couldn't be entrusted to anything except her own hands. She opened every seam on each new stuffed animal, and every decorative pillow, ran her fingers along every layer of lining, removed the backing from every picture frame, examined every hollow space beneath the light, then sewed everything closed again with the neat stitches of a nurse accustomed to holding a needle. "I need to know with my own hands that they're safe," she said when Cole stood in the doorway watching her work, concern in his voice that she was putting herself through unnecessary suffering. She merely looked up and gave him that one answer. "Machines can be wrong, or the person operating them can make them wrong. But when I've opened something with my own hands and sewn it closed again, I'll be able to sleep." Cole watched her for a long time, then nodded, and he never mentioned the scanner again. In the evenings, a new rhythm quietly took shape inside the sun-colored room. After dinner, Cole would go upstairs to his parents, pull a chair between the 2 beds placed close together, and open the sports pages to read aloud to his father. The baseball scores, the names of players Frank remembered on some nights and forgot on others, though he always listened to his son's voice with the quiet contentment of a man who knew his own blood was sitting beside him. On the bedside cabinet, where the gutted music box had once stood, there was now a small speaker playing the waltz from the old couple's wedding day. Not the cold, mechanical melody of the old box, but a new recording performed by a pianist at Cole's request, its warm, rounded notes flowing through the bedroom like honey being poured. The first night Maggie heard it, she closed her eyes and gently swayed with the music, while Frank looked up at the new wedding portrait hanging on the wall, an enlarged and restored version of the original black and white photograph their young faces smiling beneath the bridal veil. He studied it for a long time before speaking, softly but clearly. This one is prettier. The old one. He paused for a moment. The old one played the wrong music. No one in the room said anything. No explanation was needed. The piano continued to flow, and two aged hands reached toward one another across the narrow space between the pillows. It was during an evening like that, when the waltz had just ended and the old couple had begun drifting into sleep, that Cole turned toward Tessa, who stood quietly beside the window. "I want you to stay," he said, "but not as a household servant anymore." He continued in a low, steady voice. "I'm creating a new position, full-time care manager for my parents. You'll have complete authority over every decision concerning them, their medication, doctors, medical team, security, everything. My people will answer to you in those matters." He looked directly into her eyes. "Even me. When it comes to my parents, I'll ask for your judgment before making any decision." Tessa remained still. "I'm not a doctor," she said softly. "I don't have advanced qualifications. I was dismissed from my last position. You've seen my record. You saw what 8 of the finest doctors in this state failed to see," Cole replied, his voice unwavering. "You risked your job and your life to uncover the truth while every person with credentials turned away. To me, that is worth more than every degree in the world." Tessa looked toward the 2 beds standing close together, where Frank and Maggie were breathing steadily beneath the gentle glow of the night lamp. Their silver heads inclined toward one another, their faces no longer tightened in fear as they waited for 3 o'clock in the morning to descend upon them. In that moment, another figure passed through her mind, a thin woman lying on a narrow bed in another city, a hand Tessa had released too late because she had remained silent for too long. This time was different. This time, she hadn't remained silent. She turned back toward Cole and nodded. "I accept." That night, Tessa sat in the armchair positioned between the 2 beds. A thin blanket spread across her knees while the night lamp cast a warm, honey-colored glow upon the wall. The old couple had been asleep for a long time, their steady breathing mingling in the stillness. Near 3 o'clock, Frank shifted slightly, and Tessa's entire body tightened at once, following the reflex that had been carved into her over the past several weeks. Her hand instinctively moved toward the bedside table, and her heart leaped as she waited for the familiar scream. But the old man merely pulled the blanket a little higher, smacked his lips softly in his sleep, then returned to his steady breathing, his hand still holding his wife's across the narrow space between the 2 beds, as though he had never once let go throughout the night. The hands of the clock on the wall moved past the number 12, exactly 3 o'clock, then 1 minute past 3, then 2 minutes past 3. Nothing happened. There was no scream, no humming, no ghost calling a name from the darkness, only the peaceful breathing of 2 elderly people and the faint ticking of the clock. Tessa slowly relaxed her shoulders, leaned back against the chair, and allowed that silence to flow over her like warm water. It was the perfect silence that, 8 weeks earlier, even the entire fortune of the most powerful man in Chicago had been unable to buy, a silence now protected not by money or weapons, but by the watchful eyes of a woman the whole world had once considered unworthy of being heard. And perhaps that is what this story was meant to leave behind, that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't hiding in the darkness outside, but sitting beside us at the family table, wearing the face of the person we trust most. That elderly people, even when their memories have begun to leave them, still deserve to be heard and believed, because what matters most in the end isn't how much they can still remember, but how we treated them during the days when they needed us most. And that the true worth of a human being has never been measured by the diploma hanging on a wall or the title printed on a business card, but by the courage to raise a voice for someone who can no longer protect themselves, even when speaking may cost us everything. If tonight's story has touched something in your heart, please press the like button. Share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel, so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful and deeply moving stories. We would truly love to know how you feel about the story of Tessa, Cole, and the old couple, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment and share the emotions that have risen from the deepest place in your heart, because every message you write is a precious source of encouragement to us. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment. We wish you and everyone you love lasting health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the stories still to come.